Welcome, folks, to episode 1 of Mixed Extents. Today, we're going to be talking about cloud versus on-prem. My name is Mark Wilkinson. With me, as always, is Anthony Nocentino and Anthony Prusky. Today, we have special guests David Klee, Joey D'Antoni, and Melody Zacharias. David Klee is the founder and chief exorcist of Heraflux Technologies, Microsoft MVP, Vmware vExpert. He specializes in cloud/virtualization and performance, data center architecture, and risk mitigation through HADR. You can read things he has to say at davidklee.net, or you can follow him on Twitter at KleeGeek. Also have Joey D'Antoni, principal consultant, Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. He's also a Microsoft MVP. Over 20 years of experience working in both Fortune 500 and smaller firms, co-author of Introducing SQL Server 2016 and SQL Server 2019 Administration Inside Out. You can read his thoughts at joeydantoni.com and follow him on Twitter at JD. How do you say your Twitter handle?
JDanton.
JDanton. There we go. And then last but not least, Melody Zacharias, Senior Microsoft Solutions Manager at Pure Storage, also an MVP and a Microsoft Regional Director, author of the Let Them Finish book series, as well as SQL Server 2019 Administration Inside Out, has been working with SQL Server since version 6, also on the past board of directors. You can read her thoughts at SQLmelody.com or follow her on Twitter at SQLmelody. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Thanks for introducing me as Anthony Prusky, Mark.
Did I really?
It really did.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Well, we're just going to let it. Yeah, we'll let it fly.
I think we'll live with it.
Well, that's it now, Andrew. You have to change your name.
That's so much easier.
Oh, yeah.
Man. All right. Well, to get this conversation started, I thought we'd talk a little bit first about kind of what people have seen out in the wild related to successful moves from on-prem to cloud, and maybe why people think those moves were successful. Anybody's free to take that up first.
I can start. I find, especially my customers that are smaller, larger customers, for example, the customer I always like to go back to, and they weren't really a customer, they signed my paycheck for a while, was Comcast. And Comcast, we had like 5 major data centers across the US, and we bought infrastructure by the truckload. So going to cloud for a company like that is more of a matter of buying flexibility and less of cost savings, because their cost efficiencies are already pretty good. But a smaller company, like one of our clients who's a real estate data company, they were in a colo, and my worst memory of this colo was I needed like 2 terabytes more of storage for backups, and it took me a month and a half to get 2 terabytes added, which is just absurd. And we helped them move to Azure, and yeah, we have some issues. We're actually having a performance issue right now with the CPU choices we have. But at the same time, having that flexibility and having the level of responsiveness that you can only get through an automated platform like Azure or AWS is a real benefit, especially to a smaller org. I think it also, and this is one of the reasons why small and medium orgs benefit so much more from going to a cloud model, is that there's a lot of things in the cloud that you'd either have to pay for, have employees to manage, et cetera, that you kind of just get as part of the cloud deal, like being pretty highly available without doing anything other than having a VM. That's something that you don't necessarily see in an on-prem world.
Exactly. We help a lot of folks, small and large, do those transitions, and a lot of them very successful. We have a lot of fun with it. The big thing for me, for the smaller shops, they're not in the data center business. They don't really have the staff to be able to handle this stuff top to bottom, with the time or the knowledge to be able to troubleshoot a lot of the really hard issues. You get a lot of the stuff with the cloud because it is resilient. They've got the capacity. And quite frankly, they shouldn't be maintaining server equipment and patching in the middle of the night, dealing with availability. They should just be able to use the system to go do whatever they do, HVAC or distribution or logistics. They should just focus on that, focus their energies where it really makes the most sense for them. And that's one of the big areas we have a lot of fun helping people move to the cloud with, and been quite successful with it.
So in situations like that, is it just the case where they don't have the expertise, or they don't have the size of a team that they would need to actually support the data center operations?
Yes. It's a little bit of everything. You know, they have really good generalists that work there that can really tackle anything with enough Googling, but the speed to get things back up and running if there's a major issue, it takes longer because they may not be as deep in any one area where the fault lies. In this case, they can keep the generalist mantra, focus on patching, focus on using it, focusing on, you know, leveraging it properly, but they don't have to deal with the nuts and bolts of why it turns on when they hit the button to turn it on.
In addition to that, I would add, we had a pork producer in Canada that distributed pork and had in factories in multiple locations. It would actually export pork to multiple locations around the world. And what they would do is run cloud managed instances in different locations around the world where they would distribute their pork. And they would have those managed instances, and they didn't have the staff in those locations, but they wanted compute in those areas. So they would have those managed instances there. They didn't have staff for those locations, and they didn't honestly have enough DBAs to staff that. So they would have those locations to be able to have the resources there. They had one DBA basically for this entire operation, and that worked really well for them, just because of the ability to scale up whenever they needed to, have those resources where they needed them, and be able to scale really quickly.
That's an interesting. Oh, sorry.
Let you
That's
go,
an
Anthony, you
interesting
go
point, is the ability to get resources physically adjacent to your business without having to drop in a field of technical experts to maintain that. So you think about the benefits of cloud in the technical constructs, but that's a very valid business point that you just described there, to get resources close to the actual business.
There's resources on demand as well, like Joey said, waiting, was it 2.5 months for more space, where in the cloud it's I need more space. Oh, thank you very much, I have it now.
Yeah, I
So
had a
it's that
similar
on-demand resources.
I had a similar experience with a customer where I needed to seed 40 terabytes to begin replication, and it took me 6 weeks to get that array moved between the two sites because they would not let me send it over the wire.
I was working for a large software vendor in the Redmond, Washington area, and I allocated 256 terabytes in 10 minutes. It was kind of amazing.
Yeah, the last time I needed to deploy something of that scale on-prem, it took 4.5 months, but we needed 16 petabytes of all flash for one really big system. But it was 4.5 months of accelerating and phone calls every single day to make it happen.
How many cabinets was that?
Sorry, what was that?
How many cabinets was that for all that storage? I'm just curious as to compactness nowadays.
3.
Wow, that's pretty dense, but still,
it was amazing.
So in that same line, we kind of talked about resources and people. Let's kind of take a different approach to that. What about skills? Like, what are the skills that you think for the DBAs that are listening, that are kind of starting to look at cloud? What's kind of like if you were to give them a very short learning path of 3 things to learn, what would you kind of get them going towards in their cloud journey to get from being a classic DBA into the cloud?
I want to start with this one.
You go for it.
Bottom line, learning about the tools that are available to you in the cloud. Step number 1. What tools do you have at your disposal? Because a lot of DBAs love to reinvent the wheel, and that's because they want to do things their way, which is great. But when you have a toolbox of 150,000 tools, why go mill your own? You want to leverage what's out there. So understanding what's possible is great. Second, understanding how the pieces fit together so you can meet your performance and availability SLAs. That's a big one. The third one for me is more subtle, and that is efficiency. Not necessarily performance, because in the cloud, everything is based off of resource allocations with what we deal with anyway, not necessarily consumption. So if I can minimize the footprint of what we've allocated and maintain performance, I save the organization money. If you do this successfully, you get you potentially might get a raise. You save the company tons of cash. You get more toys. You get better training. Everybody wins by doing it that way. So to become an efficiency expert rather than a quote performance tuner, I claim you end at the same spot with better performance, but you save a lot of money and a lot of complexity along the way.
I would say networking and storage are the first two things I think it's really important that they understand, because the structure of the way networking and storage work in all three major clouds is very, very different to an on-prem world, and having those skills is important. You also may not have folks on your team that fully understand the networking and storage, so it might be on you, because there's a construct in Azure that we all know because we work with availability groups called an internal load balancer, that you have to kind of understand how that works to build an availability group, and your network administrator probably doesn't understand that, especially if they're new to Azure. So there's the two of the big things. And then I think, to David's point, is kind of understanding the tool set. There's about 20 different ways you can run a thing in Azure without doing a service, creating a VM, right? And I think having some good understanding of the platform is really, really helpful.
And just to make things more complicated, I'm going to say they're both right, but make sure your basics are solid. Always make sure your basics are solid. I mean, a lot of what you already know as a DBA is going to get translated into the cloud. So have confidence in yourself and remember that those skills get translated. So make sure your basics are solid. Make sure that you at least have a little bit of PowerShell. A lot of those skills can be reutilized. You've got your CLI. A lot of what you can do can be reutilized in the cloud. So make sure those basics are solid and utilize what you've got. Make sure you know how to use things like Azure Data Studio. I'm still surprised at how many DBAs don't know how to use Azure Data Studio to its fullest extent, and keep learning some of those basics.
Yeah, everything that we learn builds upon everything else. It's funny how things come full circle. I'm an absolute geek. I was compiling Slackware kernels for Linux when I was in the 5th grade, and now SQL Server runs on Linux, and I'm actually getting back into Linux again, and it's a lot of fun. But it all builds in really strange, unexpected ways at times.
Now, kind of back to the efficiency thing, as well as the basics. Do you find that the same number of DBAs are able to manage more cloud infrastructure than they would be on-prem? I know a lot of people say, move to the cloud and you can get rid of your DBA. I know that's not the case, but I was wondering,
the DBA's job is over. The cloud will automate it away. The
DBA's job is always over. We know this. It has been for the past 15 years, but
to me, it depends on the level of involvement the DBA needs on a particular system. If it's a third-party vended app and you literally turn it on, make sure it's being backed up, make sure it's highly available, spot check it periodically. If that's all you can do, does it need a lot of hand-holding? Not really. If you get some of these big, massive systems that we work on, you may have multiple DBAs for one database. The act of having to not patch stuff in the middle of the night or not be as tightly integrated with a lot of the pieces around it saves you time. I claim in some environments you're able to manage more, in other environments you're able to manage better. And it gives you more time to be proactive instead of reactive, and that's a big thing for me.
Is this it depends? Are you saying
guaranteed? Always depends.
Oh wait, it depends.
Yeah. Always.
I mean, that's really the whole show, is it depends. But hopefully we can have conversations to give people an idea of when it depends, what it depends on.
Well, I think David raised a good point there. I think the cloud takes away the boring stuff, the stuff that I don't want to spend my work hours on, and it frees me up to spend more time doing the stuff that I'm interested in, which I think is it's going to be beneficial. I don't want to sit there patching servers every month. I really don't. I know it's a core job, but if something can take that away from me, all the better.
Yeah, I'm 40 and I've been patching systems for 25 years. I'm so sick of that. I just want that to work.
I think that's the important thing that we need to take away from that message of automation is taking away DBA jobs. automation should be taking away the boring stuff that we don't want to do. And that's the important message that we take away from that.
Yes.
It's taking away the things we don't want to do so we can innovate and do the fun stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the one thing that is the technology is not getting simpler, right? It's getting more complex. And so as we automate the simpler, redundant stuff, we have to focus on innovation and also just the complexity of our platforms so that we're enabling businesses, not worrying about patching things and rebooting stuff.
And I think there's a few ways you can approach cloud, and it really depends on how you do it as the answer to this question. And I just said it depends again, and I didn't mean to. If you like migrate your SQL 2008 VMs to Azure, AWS, GCP VMs, and you leave them running as VMs, and that's all you do, you really haven't bought yourself anything except a little bit probably higher availability and better higher availability, and that's probably about it, because you're still having to patch things. You're still well, if you're on 2008, you don't really have to patch that anymore. But if you're more, the more customers we see are moving to a hybrid model. They obviously have some extended VMs, and a lot of times the VMs are more cost effective, especially for higher end workloads. But the PaaS offerings are where you really start to gain those benefits, and that's where you can really see a lot of productivity improvements.
So that kind of dovetails into one of my questions that I prepped for you guys is what are the key decision points, especially in your customer that you're working with, between IaaS and PaaS, right? So, you talked about scale and things like that, Joey. Like, what are the other things for the group that you're seeing in those decision points between IaaS and PaaS?
How many bad practices do you want to bring along with you? It's how much legacy garbage do you have that you can't adjust, like third-party vended code, hard-coded things that nobody either has the interest or the time or the willingness to go retool. Those are the things where IaaS works fine. I don't like bringing that stuff along, but a lot of times we don't have a chance. Don't have the time to go update it, or really the business isn't willing, or third-party vended apps hold your hands behind your back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the astounding number of bad ISV apps that fill the world is why IaaS will never die, because there are so many. And Vicky Harp, who's a group program manager at Microsoft, turned me onto this article that was in Forbes a couple of years ago about how this venture capital firm has bought all of these crappy ISVs, and they just the devs get outsourced to the lowest cost country they can find, and they get paid like $5 an hour, and that's why we have so many. That's why we'll always have jobs tuning queries for crappy ISV apps, and that's why we're never going to be 100% PaaS.
So the one that's in the middle between IaaS and PaaS is managed instance. Is that a technology that helps attack that problem?
Yes. If the vendor
that was the goal of the technology.
Still waiting for. No, I shouldn't say that. Never mind.
Yeah, mine's still deploying.
You said it.
Mine did deploy and then it vanished 2 days later. So, but that was when it was in beta. So I'm caveating that was very, very early on. I imagine it's taken leaps and bounds since. But has anyone got experience with managed instances?
Yeah.
They work.
Yeah. I've had a couple of customers. The pork industry customer I had deployed it quite successfully with quite a few instances worldwide, and they've had quite good success with it.
Yeah, if your workloads fit within the service, I think the service is fine. It's fundamentally not that different of a service architecture than Azure SQL database. Sorry. Except that it's more highly secure and you're more isolated, and that's one of the reasons we joke about the long deployment times. But the reason why is you're going on to cold infrastructure and it's not going on to existing VMs. So there's part of that. That's part of the reasons why we've seen some of the things. Really, the big limitations I see around managed instance right now are the total size of the data, which is on the upper end 8 terabytes. Until they get hyperscale in place, I don't know that that's going to be a great option for a lot of very large enterprise workloads.
So managed instance helps us get to the cloud with potentially code that isn't compatible with Azure SQL DB and things like that. So what are like the big gotchas for the listeners that block migrations to Azure SQL DB? Like, what's the typical example?
Cross database queries.
Yeah.
Yes. Bottom line.
That's a good blocker, though, right?
Right.
It is if you can work around it. That's
Yeah.
that's the hard part. It's blocked a lot of different applications that I've seen.
Yeah. I mean, the other major ones are CLR, replication distribution, or being a replication publisher, which you can kind of replicate. Bad choice of verbs with data sync. And then file stream and file table, which are less common, but we still have a couple of customers that use those features.
Yeah. To me, for mine, it's all of that plus third-party vended app support. A lot of times they don't know about it, so they won't support it. It's the same thing we saw with virtualization 12 or 13 years ago. I don't know what this is, so I'm going to put my head in the sand and certify it in the next decade or so.
David, have you moved anybody to VMware Cloud?
No.
It's an interesting offering, and full disclosure, I wrote a white paper that VMware never bothered to publish on this. VMware Cloud to me is the perfect solution if you're an IT director whose CIO just promised the CIO or CEO that we're going to move to the cloud by the end of the year, and you have to do it like right now. Because you really do just move your VMware environment.
Lift and shift your VMs into it. I can see that being very appealing, actually.
It's terrible. It's terrible architecture.
the way I look at it, if
Joey
you
has feelings.
If you're on VMware on-prem today, and you want the easiest possible path to DR, then you replicate your data up there. If the poop hits a fan, you spin it up, you restore everything, and you're back up and running. I mean, that's the best use case that I've got for it.
Yeah, I mean, you can move to the cloud without changing any of your stuff. So, David mentioned earlier, how much of your legacy baggage do you want to carry with you? If you want to take all of it, you just move up to VMware Cloud. And I mean, so here's the real issue, right? You're not taking advantage of any real cloud features. You're not taking advantage of cheaper storage. And you're paying VMware and your cloud vendors, so it's like twice as expensive.
It is. That is the biggest blocker that I see. I didn't want to bring it up directly, but the price tag on it, they're very proud of their solution. Now, the different cloud providers out there do have different offerings for this, and that's, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Oracle Cloud now, they're all working on this area. The price tags are not cheap, but if you've got a massive environment and you need DR failover in the most simple and straightforward manner, I claim it works fine for that. Would I opt to go to that as a primary platform? I don't know, because I would say, just like you said, if you're lifting and shifting everything, why not move to IaaS as the next step out there without this extra layer underneath? But there's use cases for it. So if there wasn't, they wouldn't have done it.
Well,
trying to be nice and impartial.
Are you talking about a lift and a shift and a move to the cloud, or are you talking about a hybrid DR kind of scenario? Those are completely different scenarios, right?
Yeah.
Because there's completely different other options for hybrid scenarios or DR situations that are much better.
The use case that I see customers bringing up is, I need to have the easiest possible DR, so it's there. We replicate our data up. If something happens, I spin it up and recover into it.
Do you find that's kind of a gateway, if you will, to people starting to put stuff into the cloud? Like, they set up some DR solution and then, hey, that was pretty easy. Let's spin some more stuff up.
Yeah, DR is the easiest use case to get out to the cloud. It's cheaper than running a second facility for equipment. Depending on how you do it, it's either a little cheaper or a lot cheaper and a whole lot less complex. And it works great for that. And it really is a gateway drug to get everything out there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And not only that, I think that's almost the way of the future. I don't know that in IT that we're going to be so much a situation where enterprises are any longer either an on-prem or a full on-prem or a full in the cloud situation. I think we're moving to most organizations, if not all organizations, going to be some sort of hybrid organization. Yeah. And it's just going to be a matter of what is your percentage of hybrid.
Yeah, it's pick the right tool for the job at that point.
Exactly. And that's what most organizations are looking at. They no longer are saying lift and shift. No, that's no longer a scenario in people's mantras. It's a matter of, we are a hybrid organization, and yeah, it's got to be the best tool for the job.
Yeah, and that's where it goes back to understanding the tools. It's, what tool can I leverage to make my life the easiest? And that's cloud automation. But now you can do it there or on-prem, single pane of glass, and everything just works. And that's just powerful. That's cool.
So speaking of tools and everything, what I guess what do you see people doing, or what should be people be doing for hybrid scenarios where, like in regards to monitoring software and things like that? Because I know Azure, AWS, a lot of the providers have tools for monitoring and alerting when something goes wrong with a VM or something, for instance. But if you've got a hybrid solution where you've still got some stuff on-prem, you're kind of stuck using your on-prem monitoring system to monitor both places, or at least that would be my thought. I don't know what everybody has kind of seen people do.
Well, in Azure, you can deploy Azure Monitor to on-prem systems, and they kick back to the cloud. So, assuming you're in that full hybrid model, that kind of works. For the most part, like anybody who's hybrid typically is, you're typically less worried about monitoring your PaaS resources because those are kind of taken care of for you. Obviously, you don't alert on failure, but that's something you can kind of easily do. But if you're talking about IaaS things, just about everything's going to be IP reachable in a hybrid IaaS scenario. So for the most part, I've seen customers extend their on-prem monitoring to the cloud and not necessarily take advantage of cloud monitoring.
Yeah, and they're used to that. They've probably got a lot of automation or at least alerting built around it. Just extend it out there, do what they've already done, for better or for worse.
Yeah, so Azure has Azure Arc, which has their monitoring plugins that they have now available on-prem. And then, as you know, I work for Pure Storage, and we have the opposite. So we have monitoring available for our offerings that are in the cloud. So we do a lot of hybrid offerings, and we have offerings that are available for our cloud storage. So we have both. You can monitor your Azure on our stuff, and we can monitor Azure for the other way around. So
yeah, and just about every vendor in the tooling space has made it so that, because you're not viable business if you can't cross cloud and on-prem boundaries right now. So,
do you see a lot of companies just going to the one cloud, or do you see people splitting across, say, AWS or Azure, or is it we go to one or
multi-cloud drink?
Literally,
a lot of companies talk about going multi-cloud, and it's one of the promises of Kubernetes is that it makes it easy to go multi-cloud. It's never easy to go multi-cloud. Like, just the fact that the networking is so different between each of the cloud platforms, that's honestly probably the biggest challenge. That being said, I know, I think it's Switzerland, and I also think Australia. If you're a financial institution and you're in one public cloud, you have to be in both. And there are a few other regulatory agencies that I've heard about where you have to be effectively multi-cloud. I think it's a challenge, and I feel like I'm pretty good at both AWS and Azure, and it's not something I would ever recommend on a grand scale to a customer. Sure, might you put a copy of your web server in Amazon so that if Azure completely went down, you could still have a presence if you're a customer facing? Yeah, that's fine. But building out a full out multi-cloud infrastructure is really, really hard, and it's going to be really, really fragile. Once again, if you absolutely had to do this, and I sound like I'm pimping VMware, and I'm really not, that would be a decent solution for that, because you have the same platform on both sides, and you're kind of abstracted away from the cloud provider itself. And then obviously that's kind of the notion of Kubernetes in that scenario, where you're kind of abstracted away from the cloud provider. But I think with Kubernetes, you're not as much as you are in VMware.
Because Anthony waving his finger then about the Kubernetes mention.
I got it two times. No, but he's right. That's kind of the core concept behind Kubernetes, is being able to program against an API to deploy your systems. But the pain points come when you have to interact with the infrastructure, storage, and networking.
Yeah.
You know, and that's getting better. We're seeing that mature, but that's stuff that's literally changing within the last year, and as we move forward, as it develops.
Oh, that's still a problem on-prem, but we're not talking about tech. We're talking about people there.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of on-prem, and I guess this kind of ties into hybrid situations as well. Do you see people moving to virtualization technologies before they go to the cloud? Is there not really any relationship there?
Virtualization on-prem is a good gateway to the abstraction that gives you the flexibility to replicate the data as you see fit, depending on what your target is in the cloud. My personal stance, if you're not virtual on-prem already, there's only a few use cases that I've actually got to leave things physical at this point. And those are the kind of machines that you probably aren't putting in the cloud anyway for a lot of different reasons. Because I mean, we're talking, you know, a couple hundred CPUs, terabytes of RAM, oodles of storage, those sort of things.
I'm going to cut Melody's company for a second. If you're the kind of customer who needs pure storage to manage your workload because you need that much storage throughput, or frankly, if you're the kind of customer that needs to be on a physical server, you also probably need to have that kind of storage throughput. You're probably not going to go to the cloud. The one place where the cloud still really sucks is high-end storage performance. I mean, Microsoft has UltraDisk. I don't know what the top-of-the-line stuff at Amazon is, but like with UltraDisk, I can get 160,000 IOPS. Microsoft claims it's sub-millisecond latency, which I want to know what they use to test that, because every time I've tried to test it, it's low single-digit milliseconds. Pretty good performance. I like to say up to about the 98th percentile of workloads. But if you're in that top 2%, you need to be on-prem and you need to have a big all-flash array with thick fiber cables running from your physical server to the array.
Me and Mark both smiled there when you said if you need pure storage preventing you for throughput preventing you going to the cloud. Sound familiar there, Mark?
Yeah, sounds a bit
we both
familiar.
work for the same company, and it's a blocker for us.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but the terrible like memory to core ratios that exist for VMs in Azure and AWS. I mean, a lot of our boxes run 32 gigs of memory per core, and you just can't you can't find that.
Wait, hold on. I need to do math now. Because there's a VM SKU I know in Azure.
Yeah, I know it too. It's still a little bit less than that.
30. Oh no, yeah. I just moved a customer to VMs that had actually a lot more memory per core than that. So there's an M series that you can get with 16 cores, and it has 1.7 terabytes of RAM.
Yeah.
But 40,000 IOPS.
Not enough for that kind of a workload.
Yeah. Had something to say there, Andrew?
No.
I'll call you the right name this time.
Yeah, cheers, man. No, it's always nice to have my name gotten right.
Yeah, and honestly, go ahead, Melanie.
No, I was just laughing at Andrew.
So work together for 3 years. Yeah.
There is this weird gap, and I haven't looked. The last time I looked at Amazon VM sizes was a couple of months ago. But there's this weird gap in Azure from like 500 gigs of RAM to a terabyte. Like there are a lot of offerings in Azure, that VM offerings that have more than a terabyte of RAM, and there are a lot that have less than 500. But there's like, I don't know, there might be one or two VM types that are between that 500 and a terabyte, which is really kind of a common sweet spot for on-prem database servers in 2020.
All right. I guess we've covered a lot so far. What do people see coming in, or what would you like to see coming, I guess, in cloud technology? Like, what's missing right now for most people?
Clearly, servers with 500 gig to a terabyte of RAM.
Saw that coming. That was a good setup.
Within my needs. Yeah, other than my needs, are there common things people are seeing that just seem to be missing for customers?
I want better vendor-driven training on similar technologies for DBAs. Joey, it goes to your point. I want basics of networking in an easy to digest manner for DBAs in DBA speak. And I know we're working on some of this over here, but a lot of times it's, the vendor doesn't say this, but what do you do? So having that level of ramp up to say, for the DBA, here's networking 101, 201, 301, how to set up a router in terms that these folks understand, because they're not networking folks. They're not, they're not CC, they're not Cisco certified anything. They're great DBAs, but the backgrounds are completely different with these different layers. And it's always interesting to translate this so that they can get it. And just like Joey said earlier, these layers are generally on their shoulders when they go to the cloud. And if you get it wrong, it's not like you get it kind of wrong, you get it really wrong. And you end up with a lot of problems as a result. So that level of training or hand-holding or even automation to say, here's a suggested way to go do this, just click this button. That would be nice.
That's a great point, because if you follow the, I remember setting up, I think a while ago, and I was setting up my first, I think it was first VMs in Azure, and it's sort of like run these commands, and it'll set up your networking for you. And you go, great. What did that just do? Don't worry about it. You carry on. It's like, okay, no worries. But yeah, deep dive into taking you through the levels. This is your quick start. This is diving a little bit further. All right, this is the real nuts and bolts. It would be, as you say, in DBA speak, please, not in networking speak.
Yes, yeah. Give me the easy button if I don't care. Give me the intermediate button if I want to know why, and give me the deep dive if I want to know how.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Actually, that's a really good point. And for them to be specific for databases or related to databases, because there was a lot of best practices. When I helped that customer that set up the managed instances, a lot of their VNets, they had their sysadmin working with actually an MVP set up their VNets on this with a sysadmin. Set up those VNets, and they were set up correctly, but not specifically for those managed instances. And we actually had to tear them all down, and I had to rebuild them because they were wrong. And had they been further along in their process, it would have cost them an awful lot of money. Luckily, I had come in at a point where they only had one managed instance built. If they had had multiples built, it would have been a real problem because they all have to be in that same VNet. But if they had got a lot further in their process, it would have been a huge problem. So we were lucky we caught them early, but things like that.
I mean, think about all the billable hours
problem.
Yeah. Think about all the billable hours you lost out on by not having to redeploy 4 managed instances.
Okay, there's that.
I choose to sleep well at night before eating well during the day. I want to save everybody time.
I agree with both of you. I'd like to kind of speak to some of the challenges of that, specifically in a Microsoft world, because we're more familiar with them than Amazon and Google. The way Microsoft Learning does training and things like that, they really focus on job roles. And full disclosure, I'm involved in some of this stuff, and we get paid to do some of it. I feel like the job roles they define in a cloud world are very narrow. Like they want us to focus on DBA tasks. When DBA task in Azure you have to do backups, but at the same time, you might have to know how to configure a VNet for a managed instance and what you need to allow and what needs to talk to what. And I don't necessarily feel like the training covers that enough. So if you're listening to this and you want to learn enough about Azure to be a good DBA, take the Azure architecture training. You probably know how to be a DBA already. And there's a limited amount of stuff you need to know to be a DBA in Azure. But what you'll learn in like Azure architecture will get you further than learning how to be just a DBA in Azure.
Yeah,
That's
I think
something I've always told people when it comes to being a DBA. It's important to be a DBA, but it's really important to understand the full stack. It's always, whether you're on-prem or in the cloud, you have to understand the full stack.
Yeah, one of the things that for my customer base, when we talk about getting in the cloud, especially in the data-oriented folks, DBAs, is the first conversation you have to have is, how are you going to get connectivity back to on-prem? Because even if you don't need it today, at some time in the near future, someone's going to say, hey, I want to get access to that over a VPN or maybe some sort of private line. And you have to deal with the networking then. So even if a completely disconnected scenario, I still will work with the networking teams on-prem to make sure that we don't have overlapping IP spaces, to just deal with that then. And then
Yeah, exactly.
at some point in the future, they're going to want to put the two together, even if you're not doing it today.
For when you get that 100 gig express route put in place.
Right. Express route, drink. It just.
And keeping in mind, one of the things I've recently seen a few Forbes articles on this, that because of COVID and the need to expand because everybody's gone virtual, they've a lot of people went, particularly for workloads like VDI in the beginning of COVID, a lot of people went crazy to the cloud, but now they're realizing that it's super expensive. So a lot of people are repatriating a lot of those workloads back to on-prem. So a lot of those workloads are coming back down because they're just so expensive. And that is also now starting to come down to databases. So people who have moved cloud workloads, database workloads up to the cloud, they're finding they're kind of expensive. So some of them are now coming back on-prem just because of the expense. So keep that in mind. Even though it goes up, sometimes it has to come back down.
Yeah, that's why I love the. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
It's interesting as MVPs and people who work with Microsoft a lot, we talk about the benefits of Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance. What we didn't talk about, because for obvious reasons, is that it kind of costs a lot. And the reason why it costs a lot, it's fair. I mean, if you have a business critical SQL database or managed instances, you effectively have an availability group with 4 replicas. So you have 4 VMs that are supporting your workload. Your backups are all taken care of, included in the bill to an extent. But most places that move workloads into PaaS services don't necessarily have that kind of redundancy on-prem. So you pay for that redundancy. And honestly, I did some comparative pricing because business critical uses an availability group model, whereas general purpose relies on storage. And business critical is 2 times as much as GP, even though the number of compute instances you have is 3 to 4x. So there's some value there, but it's still the raw number is pretty expensive.
So I remember we were talking about expense. I remember a feature of SQL came out, was it 2016, called Stretch Database? And everyone went, this is great. I can migrate my archive data, show it to the cloud. Brilliant. Let's have a look at this. Oh, wait, how much? Oh,
wait, can I tell the story of StretchDB then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Sure.
StretchDB was a really cool feature, and it sucks that they changed the way they did it, because it could have been a really great feature, especially now that we have hyperscale. So what happened was engineering built the feature, and engineering built the feature to work with Azure SQL Database. So you could have a few terabytes for like $100 a month in Azure SQL DB, and it would be slow. And this was all through the CTP process. So all the CTPs, I think until the last one, it worked on Azure SQL Database. And then right before RTM, somebody decided, who was not in engineering and whose name I don't know, but somebody decided that we could make a lot more money if we sold like 20 petabytes of data to like 3 big customers than if we sold 2 terabytes of data to 8,000 customers who might actually use the feature. And so they use SQL Data Warehouse, which is astronomically more expensive for the service, and it killed StretchDB. If they had kept it on SQL Database, and then now that we have hyperscale as an option, man, that would have been a really great feature.
You could always ask them to bring it back.
We've had discussions.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about like the benefits. Let's talk about challenges. Like, what are the things that you've kind of like banged your head against, maybe smashed your keyboard, written a blog post recently about, like, what are the challenges that you're experiencing?
I feel like this is
going to the cloud.
Well, I feel this is leading somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah.
For me,
So Anthony and Rob Sewell's DMs have been flaming the last couple of days because I had to do something in Azure Automation. Azure Automation's okay. So I mentioned earlier there are about 20 ways to do things to a database within Azure. From like, you can use Azure Functions, you can use Logic Apps, you can have a VM and run a hybrid runbook. All I was trying to do is Megan Longoria, who's on my team and is a fellow MVP, DM me or messaged me on Teams the other day and was like, hey, I noticed the customer that I run the data warehouse for, the ETL user wasn't deployed in the new database that got created. What happened? And I'm like, it's in my build code. Let me go look. And I was trying to create an AAD user from a runbook. Runbooks, and I was connecting as a SQL user. I knew this was broken, and I put it off on somebody else to fix it or push it into their deployment process, and they didn't. So I had to figure out how to create an AAD user from an automation runbook. I'm pretty experienced with Azure. I've been working with Azure SQL DB for about 10 years. So I knew enough to know that I had to connect from an AAD account. However, invoke SQL CMD, which is the command that I usually use for this, doesn't support AAD off because it doesn't. Don't ask me why. We've had AAD off for like 5 years. It should freaking support it. So I DM'd Rob and I was like, hey, what's the DBA's tools way to do this? And he's like, oh, what you want to do is have an automation account connect as a managed service, and you'll be connected. So I did that. I successfully ran a query. I'm like, oh, this is going to be easy. Well, the next thing I do is I go to create the AAD user, and it's throwing some weird error. And this user was a service principal. It wasn't a like username. So it wasn't like Megan at dcac.com. So I just had create username from external provider, and it was throwing a weird error. And I was like, okay, that's weird. Let me not run it in the context of a runbook. So I run it outside, like just in Cloud Shell, and it throws the same error. And I'm like, well, that's positive, but not. So I asked Rob, and Rob's like, did you read the rest of my blog post? And I was like, no, I just have to look.
Is that a polite way of saying RTFM, right?
And so he's like, so what you have to do is grant you have to create a service principal for each of your SQL, logical SQL servers. And that's easy enough. It's one PowerShell command line. I did that. Then you add them to a group that has the directory readers role in AAD. Well, it turns out in order to have group role grants, you need to be on a premium tier of Azure Active Directory. So I had to get clearance from the client to do that. Fortunately, this is a good tip. If you ever have an Azure Active Directory feature that's not tied to a user, so for example, a group-based role assignment, you only need one user on that tier to do it. As soon as you have one user who's licensed for that tier of AAD, all of those generic features come in. So I got that done. I thought it was all wrapped, and I have my code working, and then I go to create the user, and I get permission denied. And I'm like, what the hell? I'm subscription owner. I'm global administrator of AAD. Finally, I missed something in a section of docs above where the code I was using was. I needed to use a preview PowerShell module. The best part about this preview module was, unlike the actual current module, it was dependent on Windows. So I couldn't test it on my Mac, and I couldn't test it in Cloud Shell. So I had to go to a Windows VM I had, run it, and be like, oh, okay, that fixes the problem. And then, is it going to run in my runbook? And it did. So that was a long story. The short part of that is the tooling is complicated, and like having to interact with PaaS databases, especially VMs, you can use your traditional things because they're VMs. Interacting with PaaS services is challenging, and like just beginning to work with Azure Automation is a pretty involved thing. I was talking to Erin Stellato about it recently because she did a data exposed video on it, and there's a lot to get to hello world with automation. There's a lot of understanding you have to have around the Azure platform, and that's a big challenge to a lot of DBAs.
So you mentioned there that the PowerShell preview module, just out to everyone, when you work with a scripting tool with, say, Azure or AWS or Google Cloud, would you always use PowerShell, or would you use the cloud offering CLI, like the Azure CLI, the AWS CLI? I personally use the Azure CLI mainly because I started working with Azure where they switched the module and changed every single command. We went from Azure dash into AZ dash, and that kind of did it for me.
I recorded a whole Pluralsight course, and then 2 weeks later, they changed it from the old one to the new one.
I love PowerShell. I use it every day, but sometimes
I like this. I like the CLI. It's easier to use, but in a big but, it's 100% non-supported for Azure Automation. PowerShell is your option.
Okay.
Gotcha.
So that's the challenge then, right? Is kind of this tooling, but across the whole architecture, trying to have a consistent surface area. And that's a huge challenge for both Microsoft to do and for us to consume and develop solutions with. So I'm gonna kick it over to you two, Melody and David. What are the biggest challenges, the kind of the banged keyboard scenarios for you guys?
Cost.
Cost.
Well, it cost and dealing with, what's the nicest way to say it? It's dealing with the garbage, and I choose my words very carefully here. It's dealing with the garbage that has been left to rot on the vine on all of these systems for eons.
Yes.
And they want to move it to the cloud, and they want to modernize, but they don't really want to modernize. They just want to get it out there. And a lot of times they pick a service that's incompatible with some of the legacy junk that they want to maintain, or they just want the easy button, and the architecture is so unbelievably unwieldy that it's just bad.
That's like when I'm working with customers talking about migration strategies, my first question is, what can we turn off, right? Yeah. Let's get rid of stuff and then reduce the amount of stuff that we have to move into the cloud.
The old strategy of turn off and see who notices.
There might be a little more science involved, but yes.
I don't know, there's been plenty of servers where I've gone through internal documentation, talked to people, and they've said, I'm not sure, how do we find out who's using this? And I was like, I've got a good idea. Off.
Yeah, it's true. It works. I honestly agree with Joey and I agree with David. And more than anything, I usually just, I feel bad I have a lot of empathy for my customers and my clients for the learning gap, for the DBAs and the customers who have to, for those customers that are so far behind and the DBAs that have the learning gap to make that leap. And I even see it quite often with the Microsoft people who are trying to facilitate those customers that are wanting to make that move. So I've recently in the last year worked with quite a few Microsoft reps who are incentivizing these customers to move to the cloud. And they're realizing there's this huge knowledge gap, both with the customer, the DBA, to move to the cloud. And I've been brought in to help with that knowledge gap. And there's such a gap there that both the client and Microsoft are frustrated on both sides. And bridging that gap is so frustrating for both of them that it complicates the entire process.
Yes.
So there's a lot of empathy there for both of those. And I don't know how to, obviously we all help with that, I think, but I think that's a big challenge for everybody going forward.
Well, it's hard. A lot of times training and keeping up with things, and there is so much constant change. It's left onto the person. There's no time during business hours for them to actually do any of this. I'm a glutton for punishment. I don't have much of a life. I do this nights and weekends because I want to, because I'm an absolute geek with this stuff. But a lot of other people can't. Or, at least the companies should give some time to help facilitate the training, and they have the expectation that you will go learn this, but no time to go do it. And that skills gap continues to grow, especially over time. And, I still have discussions and arguments with folks about why virtualization is a good thing, let alone cloud and automation and Kubernetes and all these other components that they should be up on, but they're not.
It's a really good point of you should, we're expected to learn this stuff. And I'm like you, David, I'm a geek. I learn this stuff outside of work, but people shouldn't be expected to do that. A lot of people just want to come, earn their money and go home and live their lives. They don't want to spend their evenings doing this stuff, and they shouldn't have to, really. So if companies aren't giving people time to learn this stuff on hours, then I don't see how they can expect to drop a new technology like the cloud on them and say, there you go, without significant problems in their near future.
I also feel like the kind of companies we're talking about probably kind of have a historic underinvestment in IT. And so they're suddenly doing a modernization effort. And let's face it, companies that don't invest in IT don't exactly get the best technology professionals, because the people who really enjoy technology want to go be consultants or work for software vendors or hardware vendors.
Yeah. So in that same context,
me and Mark disagree.
yeah, you guys are the anomaly.
I mean, there are a handful of companies like you guys, like Bwin would be another example, like where they do really amazing things with technology, but like Bob's Widgets, maybe not.
Fair point.
All right, so
Bob's
one final cloud scale widgets. So, one final question, and we'll wrap it up, team. So we just talked a lot about challenges. If in that sense, if you had one thing tomorrow in cloud, like what's that one feature enhancement, whether it be general cloud or even as specific as something like Azure SQL DB, like what's that one thing that you'd want to see developed, produced, and show up tomorrow in your portal or whatever?
Ultra disk.
Ultra disk.
Yeah, I want 3 times the amount of IO bandwidth available, and I want it in the transaction log for Azure SQL database and managed instance.
Can you attack that problem with like striping disks and techniques like that, or is it generally a real barrier that we just can't get there right now?
It's a fixed limit of your VM size where you're going to hit throttling. Okay. And you can't, the only way you can get there is striping your workload like horizontally, which is re-architecting your application.
Right,
yeah.
right.
I want the ability to pick a service or IaaS and say, here's 10 CPUs, pick the one you want. Dial up the amount of RAM you want. Dial up the number of disks. Dial up the amount of IOPS per disk, and no artificial cap at the VM layer. I want a completely custom VM to give me what I want, and I'm willing to pay for it.
Have you tried VMware Cloud?
Yes, it doesn't do that.
Joey, are you like moving companies in the near future? Just
God, no, not there.
I'm with you. I want ultra low latency on storage. I want a CPU architecture that matches my workload. I want the amount of RAM that's appropriate for it, and I don't want to have to compromise in a lot of these other areas to get, one of those, let alone all those things together. That's what I would like.
So both of you kind of gave a similar answer, like it's an infrastructure thing. Do you feel like that is because of our backgrounds as DBAs and we're used to producing and consuming things at those data rates, or as application architectures shift towards more cloud native and you're depending upon like distributed systems and scale out workloads and things like that, that problem will erode? Basically, are we the dinosaurs that are trying to get the infrastructure to do something in the cloud versus like changing the applications to be, I'm saying we're cloud ready or cloud native, whatever expression you want to use?
I want a platform that will support the workload that I'm trying to move in whatever shape or form that I can or should be moving it into.
Also, developers never understand, including the developers who build Azure, the workloads that high-end databases have as a relationship with storage devices.
Just put it in a JSON something and tuck it in the table, right? All right. So Melody, back on you for now. What's that one feature that you would like to see or enhancement?
I think to give it a different tact, I think I would like something more along the lines of a tool that would allow complete deployment, I guess, of a Kubernetes solution that can just be used, so that I don't have to, that I can just say, I want to build something, like have a complete Kubernetes, so I don't have to go out and learn all of the infrastructure behind the Kubernetes solutions, that I can just build on top of it and have that sitting there ready for me to go forward from, so I don't have to learn it all.
Yeah, no, that's funny because there's technologies that try to attack that problem.
I was about to say, if anyone from Rancher is listening.
Right. Well, I was going to go to Cloud Route with like ARM and Terraform, but you're just moving the problem from one bucket to another. I still have to learn this other thing now, right? And so I totally understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it's one of those, there's just so many things to learn, and one of those things I would rather not. One more thing I don't want to have to learn, I hate to say.
There are situations where I literally want it to just work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I thought that's what Kubernetes was supposed to do, though. Wait, you're saying we have to deploy Kubernetes to get Kubernetes?
I just want
Yes.
to be able to create an Azure Active Directory user and SQL database from automation. How hard should this be?
Exactly.
All right. Well, I guess on that note, we'll call it a show. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a great show. For those I guess for your information, we'll be on YouTube shortly. Not sure how many days out, and then also have this will be presented in an audio only podcast format as well.
So we're available wherever you get your podcasts.
Yes,
Always
which
wanted
was
to
a
say
lot
that.
of work, but it's it's now everywhere. So
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank
right.
you very much. all.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, team.
Cool. Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.